Welcome back to our discussion, Making the Online Experience Work Securely, sponsored by Akamai Technologies here on Federal News Network. I'm Tom Temin. My guest today is Dr. Robert Blumofe. He's Chief Technology Officer and Executive Vice President at Akamai Technologies. And let's zero in a little bit on the cybersecurity topics, because there's an executive order on cybersecurity, followed up by lots of policy statements, bit by bit dribbling out of the Office of Management and Budget. I mean, the scene and the temperature are raising here for cybersecurity. And in the context of what we were talking about before the break, don't backhaul cyber attacks into your data center when they're happening at the edge and so forth. That's, I would say, a best practice. What are some other best practices agencies should be using with their edge, their hybrid cloud, and their data center interacting environments to keep themselves secure?
Right. Well, in my opinion, the executive order is really quite remarkable. It's, in my opinion, a real tour de force of best practice in cybersecurity, clearly authored by people who really know their stuff. And I think there's a lot of really good content in there. And I know it was also followed up with various communication to industry with guidelines on how to secure against ransomware and other types of cyber attacks. And again, from everything I've read, there's a real strong emphasis on cybersecurity best practice. And I think best practice that really resonates very strongly with me. I believe these guidelines really are focusing on the right ideas. And in the executive order in particular, there's a number of things in there, including things related to software development lifecycle, bill of materials, communication, investigation, a whole bunch of things, as well as zero trust and multi-factor authentication. And those are probably good ones for us to maybe spend a little bit more time on. In my opinion, those are both zero trust and multi-factor authentication, really capabilities that live at the core of any good cybersecurity defense posture.
Yeah, let's talk about the idea of zero trust first, which means that each session has to be authenticated, each user movement or going on to a new application needs authentication. You don't trust anybody. And can that interact with that edge computing model where we were saying that move the data to where move the computing to where the data is, if that's the appropriate measure. So how does zero trust and the application of the authentication itself, I mean, authentication is an application in some sense to look at it technically. How does that work in this edge hybrid data center model?
Right. There's a lot of language out there around zero trust and what it is. In my opinion, I really think of zero trust as essentially a very strong form of the ages-old principle of least privilege. And there's really very few concepts that are more important in cybersecurity than least privilege. Never give anybody or any device or any entity any more privilege than it absolutely needs to get its job done. And even as an executive with a company, you could ask for privileges, and of course you'd be granted them because you're an executive. By virtue of your status in the company, you could be given these privileges. But the better answer is no. The better answer is to not give people privileges that they don't absolutely need, even when they're executives. And zero trust really takes that to a very deep point. And it's very different really than the traditional network-based access model, where traditionally users are given more privilege than they really need. And that's where the term trust comes in, because in some sense, they're being trusted in a manner that I think is antithetical to this idea of least privilege. And the example that I'm trying to give here is the one around network access, where traditionally, when you want to access, say, corporate applications or agency applications, you're given access to that corporation's network. Once you're given access to the network, well, you can look around on that network, you could probe the network, you could look for vulnerabilities. Now, you might not do that because you're a good person, but what if there's malware on your machine? What if there is somebody who has compromised your machine? Anything you can do with your machine, well, they can do. So even if you're a good person and you're not going to take advantage of these privileges, bad guys might. And why do you need the privilege of being on the network? You don't need that. You don't need to be able to, well, maybe if you're a network administrator, you do, but most of us are not network administrators. We don't need network access. We need application access. Zero Trust says, don't give network access, instead give application access. Give access only to those applications that the user is entitled to use. And that is a really critical point. And the edge can actually be the place where you implement that. You make the decision on whether or not you're allowing this person to access the application at the edge, right near them. So they never even get beyond that edge component if they're not actually allowed to use that application. A very strong form of least privilege, and one that I think is really a cornerstone for a good cybersecurity posture.
Sure, in many ways, a new take on the idea of defense in depth, which is keeping that outer perimeter really out there. And what about for multi-factor authentication, stressed by every agency nowadays, and of course in the executive order? Is that also an edge occurrence?
Can be. And I do think that we really need to be looking at multi-factor authentication and the use of passwords and trying to move forward in terms of how it is that we authenticate users. Because Zero Trust really can't have any power if you can't have strong authentication. Because the Zero Trust component, this thing that lives at the edge and only grants access to those who should be granted access, well, you need to know who they are, and you need to with a high degree of assurance know who they are. And that's where the multi-factor authentication comes in. That lets you know with a very high degree of assurance that I am indeed Robert Blumoff, CTO at Akamai Technologies, for example. And it's such an important capability, and it also needs to be implemented in a way that's strong, because I can tell you we've seen implementations of multi-factor authentication that are actually easy to get around. We see phishing kits out in the wild that actually have multi-factor authentication bypass built in. They literally, the phishing kit has MFA bypass built in, and that's because they're taking advantage of weak forms of MFA. So when we think about MFA, we really have to think about phish-proof forms of MFA, which means using the right cryptography, which probably means FIDO2 compliance. And ultimately then what we're looking for is FIDO2 compliance that's easy to use, because if it's not easy to use, nobody's going to adopt it. And so in my opinion, that's where this needs to go. Zero Trust combined with a very strong form of multi-factor authentication that's easy to use.
Because I would think that one of the dangers is the traditional man in the middle type of attack, where factors could be intercepted rather, or wrong code sent and something happens, and you can imagine all sorts of lurid outcomes there.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we're all familiar with those. We've all used web applications where they want to send you an SMS with a code, something like that. Those are really easy to phish. And I've seen people, by the way, come to the wrong conclusion, which is that means that you can't use your cell phone for MFA. You need to, the cell phone is an insecure component of an MFA solution. That's not the case. It's simply that these particular protocols are insecure. They're easy to man in the middle. They're easy to phish. If done right with FIDO2 cryptography, the cell phone actually can be used as an agent in multi-factor authentication. And what's nice about it is it's something we all already carry. It's not an additional thing that we now have to carry, worry about losing or anything like that. We all already carry them, and they've all got biometric built in. Every cell phone out there that anybody's using these days has biometric built in.
So treat the cell phone then as a peripheral and as that outer layer of security that we mentioned before, like any other edge device.
Exactly. Again, and what I really like about it, it's ubiquitous. We've all got it. It's got biometric built in. The key is we really just have to get the cryptography right and make sure that we're using something that's FIDO2 compliant. Don't use SMS, for example.
Got it. Well, you've given us a lot to think about. So I want to thank today's guest is Dr. Robert Blumoff. He's Executive Vice President and Chief Technology Officer at Akamai Technologies. I'm Tom Temin. You're listening to Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, please visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Akamai Technologies.